This is Learning Works, a podcast presented by Hone. It's a series of in-depth conversations with L&D experts, HR leaders, and executives on how they've built game-changing learning and development strategies, unleashed business growth through talent development, and scaled their global L&D teams.
Thinking about McDonald's, for example, when I first came there, we had a very large sort of instructional design team, probably 3 times larger than it was when I left. And we made a conscious decision to keep a core set of people and frame their roles like architects. So your job is to create blueprints, but not build houses. And then we'll go find the general contractors out there of the world that can help us build houses.
Tune in for the wisdom and actionable insights, the best in the industry. I'm Tom Griffiths, CEO of Hone. Welcome to Learning Works. Today, we're joined by Rob Lauber, who has spent over 30 years as a learning leader for companies like Yum Brands and Cingular Wireless, most recently serving as the Chief Learning Officer at McDonald's for over 6 years. Rob has been named Chief Learning Officer of the Year by CLO magazine and has served as chair of the board for ATD, the premier professional association for learning and talent professionals. Rob serves as a board member and strategic advisor for over a dozen innovative learning companies and is currently the founder of XLO Global, a consultancy designed to drive strategic value for business and workforce development efforts. We're thrilled to have Rob join us on the Learning Works podcast. Rob, welcome.
Tom, thanks for having me. Really glad to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. Likewise. That is quite the resume in L&D. I would love to wind back right to the start and just understand, how did you get your start in L&D? What drew you to the space?
I got out of college. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I was doing a job at a company called Dun & Bradstreet, and I was pretty good at it. And they asked me to go and move from where I was in New York City down to Atlanta to help train people and how to do what I do. So I said, sure, I'll do that. And I did about 3 years of stand-up sales training, basically, is what it was. And that was okay. I don't know that it was like super passionate for me. I was burned out, honestly. And one day our president of our organization came down and said, I'm going to close down this center because we're sending new hires down here. They're treating it like 60%, but they get a nice trip out of us. And we need to find a better way to do this. So instead of just laying you off all right now, I'm going to give you, I think we had about 120 days to come up with an alternative way of the way we should do it, assuming that wasn't without that constraint. And so myself and 2 others came up with a completely new design. And that was my sort of experience or intro to instructional design and the whole world of thinking about how people learn and trying to map that to how people need to perform tasks and get jobs done and those kind of things. And so that unleashed me basically into my career.
That's great. So you'd been doing the job in the sales world and then we're teaching people to do that as well, and then develop that into an instructional design mindset. Because oftentimes when someone can do the job, it doesn't necessarily mean they can teach it. I think you gain that extra appreciation for instructional design when you actually have to go and get other people to do it. So that sounds great.
Yeah, and it wasn't a spray and pray model where I'd stand up and basically spew everything I knew. So we had to think more deeply about what it is we were trying to get from an outcome perspective. And that really helped set the premise for my thinking going forward for most of my career.
That's great. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. If we fast forward then to the present, I would love to know what you're working on right now and what is most exciting to you.
Yeah, I'm working on a home renovation. No, as a side. No, right now
it's a full-time job sometimes.
Yeah, some days picking tile is not the most exciting thing. It's way overrated. But no, on the work side, I'm still fairly actively engaged in the community. So I'm on the Chief Learning Officer magazine editorial advisory board. I do some workforce advisory work for a variety of different sort of venture capital firms and some other places as well. And then I do some consulting directly to enterprises around learning strategies, how they're thinking about their business model, their infrastructure, their content, those kind of things. And then I work fairly deeply with, I think you mentioned about a dozen different companies in the startup world on the front edge of technology, or I would say lately, more companies try to make a pivot into from B2C models to B2B models, and how they go to business, how they go to market with enterprises, and how they have the conversation about their learning offering with people like me.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. It's awesome that you've had the opportunity to have such a long career in the L&D space in-house, and now be in a position where you can share that experience and knowledge and wisdom so widely with startups of all shapes and sizes. I'd be curious, over those 30 years, how have you seen the operating model of L&D shift over time, and where do you think that's headed?
Yeah, I've seen it pivot from low tech to high tech, I think, is the direction I would say. The gradient of when I started doing the work, it was before the internet. So we were still pushing paper and early days of things like Word and Excel and PowerPoint, to now I think we're on the cusp of generative AI really being a super strong engine for how learning content gets developed. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit, but you've seen a progression on multiple fronts with sort of technology enablement, I guess I'll call it. And that seems to be driving shifts, I would say, and continuous disruption in the learning space.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been dying to ask you about the time at McDonald's, because, of course, everyone knows it as the global brand that it is today. And when I was thinking about the training or learning and development strategy needed for McDonald's, of course, there's the head office piece that may be more common with other companies, but just the scale of the frontline operations in the restaurants. I was curious, was that part of your remit as well, to think through training for them?
It was actually, that was the biggest part of my remit, was thinking through how and or modernizing how we help people learn in the restaurants and how we help them learn their jobs. And I use those words very deliberately because it would be naive to think at a company the size of McDonald's that you can forcibly train a population of over 1.5 million people, 1 million of which are new every year coming into the job. So it's more, yeah, I would say it was a daunting effort up front, but you really had to think about themes that were common across geographies and across franchises and across restaurants when you were doing the work.
That's massive. I come from a small country called Wales, and our population is 3 million. So you're teaching the equivalent of half our country. McDonald's, that's amazing. I mentioned that just in relation to the tech question, because I'd be curious, were there technologies that allowed you to do that restaurant training more effectively, as well as all of the technology that you can imagine has helped with head office and other places?
Yeah, I think two things. I think technology overall helped drive consistency. Yeah. So how do we make sure that the training in the UK is similar to, or in Wales, is similar to the training in Nashville, Tennessee, where I am today, right? Because essentially, as a customer, you walk into a McDonald's in either place, and it's pretty much the same. Some slight variation, maybe a product, but largely looks the same, operates the same, does many of the same things. So thinking about how technology can help you drive consistency was job number one, I think, in terms of the way we thought about technology. The second way we thought about technology was then really around minimizing the interruption with actually doing the job. Because restaurants in general are like manufacturing environments. Basically, raw goods come in the back door, get made to a spec, and served to a customer at the counter. So it's a production-driven, time-driven environment. So pulling people off to sit in a webinar for an hour and a half or to go somewhere for a class just isn't practical. And so you really have to think about environmental constraints and how technology can help you overcome some of those pieces. So concepts like microlearning and concepts like self-paced bits and bytes that people can pull, or people's ability to learn one aspect of the job as opposed to the entirety of being a crew person. So if I just want to be a cashier, how can I just learn how to do that? To being able to retrieve knowledge at the moment I need it for things that I probably won't remember in some e-learning course that I took 6 months ago. So technology really becomes an underpinning enabler to thinking about overall design strategies we can take that help it fit closer into the flow of the way people work and those restaurants actually operate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's so many pieces to that. And it obviously works so successfully. I imagine there's the onboarding piece where we're just getting people up to speed so that they can start doing a job. Then there's the ongoing learning piece where they're developing themselves, like you said, with e-learning, micro-learning, webinars. And then there's the just-in-time, I've forgotten how to process checks instead of credit cards. And so I need to figure that out. What were some of the kind of thorniest examples or hardest things that you found to train people on across those different life cycle stages?
Yeah, I think at McDonald's, I think it's a super task-driven organization, so it's very procedural. If you ever see the movie The Founder or any of those kind of things, part of the great part about McDonald's is that they drive consistency through consistent procedure. Very super operational excellence focused is the big business term for it. But on the other side of it, then getting people to think beyond that and use their brain to sit there and say, in this situation, I should deviate a little bit from the procedure to deliver a better experience for the customer. That's actually the hardest part of, I think, the job overall from a learning and development perspective. So one of the brand tenets at McDonald's was around creating feel-good moments. And that the brand purpose why people go to McDonald's is to feel good, either through the food or through the experience, or because they can sit in a corner and nobody will bother them, whatever it might be. It's to get the break. And so getting that into the mind of a crew person around that's the essence of why you're there, is to create that feel-good moment. Can be challenging when there's not really a procedure for it, because every customer has a different need state and every customer is an individual and needs to be treated differently as individuals. So those things were very challenging. The softer side, I would say, is the challenging part of it. Also, super difficult to measure, right? Are you doing it right? Could you have done it better? Right? Those kind of sort of evaluation measures and that whole can of worms becomes also difficult piece as well, because it's very hard to tell, is that what success looks like or not?
Yeah. So taking the process-oriented parts of the learning almost with a manufacturing mindset to make that excellent and perfecting that for consistency. And then above and beyond that, trying to instill values and giving people a bit of space or leeway to implement or get creative about how they deliver those moments to customers. And that, like you say, is harder to deliver, harder to measure. I wonder, were there differences between restaurants or regions where you could see the impact of leaders or managers who were more pro-learning or better at instilling learning and development than others, and saw a measurable difference at all?
Yeah, I think you could. The easier way to think about it in the McDonald's context would be like across franchisees. Yeah, because the franchisees really own sort of those sets of businesses, and they set the culture for the estate that they own. And so I'd say you'd see it more across that line. And then what would show up in measures and metrics would be some of the softer things around the business, which would be around turnover, right? So employee retention. You'd also see it probably in a customer satisfaction metric, right? Which is a natural outcome of the turnover, because the more novices you have in the restaurant, the more likely you are to deliver a subpar experience, either through the product or just your engagement overall. So those things tended to show up where there were patterns of leadership, I would say, acceptance and buy-in and belief that their business is driven by people more than it is driven by process. Yeah,
that's great. We see a similar effect when we look at our learners and ask to what degree you felt supported by your manager or supervisor in implementing the learning that you just received. And there's a clear correlation between the level of support from the manager and then the degree to which people are implementing and being seen to implement the learning. So it's great to see it show up in that context as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's an age-old, right, obvious measure there.
For sure. So I'd be curious, what do you think are the hardest things about being a CLO or a learning leader? And what lessons have you taken from facing those challenges for yourself?
The hardest things, it's a really good question because there are a lot of hard things, I think.
Yep.
And I talk to peers of mine who have different sets of hard things than I do too. But I think that there's a few sort of common themes that emerge that are like, require constant attention as a CLO, I'd say. One is keeping your finger on the pulse of the business. So really thinking about what's happening in the business and trend spotting. Where's our business headed? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? What are the implications for that for the business? What kind of requests can I anticipate as a result of that? And requests might be, we need more because we're growing really fast, or we need less, so give me $1 million out of your budget. So how do you think about and think ahead about those things and anticipate? I think that's one. I think the other one is around, there's a sort of the shifting paradigm around training versus learning, I would say, right? And a lot of learning and development organizations, now sometimes called talent development organizations, are really heavily focused traditionally on a product, right? And that's a library of content or experiences that they create, manage, and push out in the organization. And I think organizations are challenging learning and development organizations, especially CLOs today, to think a bit beyond that and think about culture, for example, as how are you helping to drive the culture forward in the organization? How are you helping to enable shifts that we're going to make maybe 2 or 3 years from now as an organization? How does your plan map to our strategic plan conversations? So I think there's that side of the coin combined with learners today have better technology in their pocket than you're probably delivering on their desktop. Mm-hmm. How do you meet the TikTok kind of generation expectations when that may not necessarily be the best pedagogy for what you're trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think striking that balance around engaging your consumer and creating demand by your consumer is also a continuous challenge in the organization as well.
Yeah. And I think a through line there was trends, and at least fitting trends, probably anticipating trends. And I love how you started with thinking through the business insights or tracking the business progress and anticipating what would be needed in future. That's been a bit of a common theme when I talk to the more experienced senior learning leaders, where it really is just like second nature to think business first, as opposed to being the order taker or seeking to create too much of a fiefdom in just a learning product. It's being that business partner to the other executives that you work with and helping learning strategy drive supporting pillar to the business strategy. That's great to hear.
I think it's easy to step out to see yourself as next to the business as opposed to in the business. To be successful as a CLO, you have to be in the business.
Absolutely.
Right? I think that's a mindset frame I would use.
Yeah. And I think it helps the rest of the C-suite see the value and support, and then to a previous point, champion the initiatives that are coming from the learning function if they see it as part of their business as well.
That's right. Yeah. And I think it opens a whole new can of challenges, right? A whole new set of challenges for you as a CLO when you do step in from being aside from the business to being in the business. The expectations for you to provide strategic insight beyond the pillar of your responsibility is also there at the same time.
Right. So let's talk training. We chatted in the past and you've described formal training as one of the most expensive, least efficient, hardest to measure, disruptive commitments that an organization could make. And as a learning leader, that's a really interesting observation. When do you think it does make sense to use formal training, and when should people check the bias that they might have towards doing something like that in favor of something else?
Yeah, it's good. I would use some harsh words there, so thanks for repeating them. But putting me on the spot. But I do think if we're honest about it, we take people away. Formal training takes people away from doing what the business needs done. So it's a bit of a disconnect. I do think that there are moments where it drives a lot of value. One is in the context of, and these are themes more than like this type of training versus that type of training, but I think the need for people to build relationships with other people in the organization at a networking level, I would say, right? As, hey, I know Tom. I was in a meeting with Tom. We had a great conversation over lunch, kind of Tom conversation, and now I can call Tom and ask him a question. I think there's a huge amount of value there in the relationship piece. I think organizations recognize that, which is why a lot of them are asking people or conscribing people to come back to work in an office, right? Because there's a huge amount of value around sort of the water cooler conversation, the passing the person in the hall, the standing online in the lunchroom with somebody kind of conversations that can happen that ultimately pay dividends in helping people get their jobs done overall and seeing the bigger picture. So I think that's one of the sort of value drivers of it. I think the other one is around where you're really trying to drive a consistent mindset in the organization. So thinking about onboarding is the easy example. But in the onboarding process, a lot of what you're trying to do is introduce people to the values and culture of your organization and what it's like to work there and what's expected of you to work there. So I think that sort of stepping away from, let's not get to the job yet. Let's think about what it means to be a citizen of this company and how we want you to work and how we want you to lead and how we want you to play is important conversations that are best done in a set aside moment as opposed to maybe a 30-second video clip. So I think the investment in time and that the discussion piece of that is super important where the engagement is needed. So I do think that there's places and times for it. And I think largely organizations have moved away from that, from face-to-face being everything. 40 years ago, that was the construct that you had to work within. 30 years later, you don't. And so I think that now we can do it this way, even virtually, right? But I do think that there has to be intentional sort of design pieces of training where people actually need to step away from the task at hand and focus on the mindset pieces that we need people to get their heads around that will help them do their work.
Yeah, agreed. And so times when social connectivity is an important outcome, or perhaps where stepping away from the workplace can give you the headspace to really shift your mindset, particularly when you're joining an organization, to embrace the principles or the values of that new place, gives a more kind of profound experience that way. And then right at the opposite end of the spectrum, I guess there's micro learning for small key concepts, whether that's about a proprietary product or some kind of framework. I think in between, there's this relatively recent modality of live online where you get the advantage of the scalability and the access and to some degree the bite-sized nature, but you also get the live interaction and a bit of the social piece as well. So I'd be curious what you've seen as a good fit for that modality where interaction is still important. Perhaps it doesn't need to be fully immersive, but yeah, where does that work in your mind?
I think the live online model can work when duration's an interesting piece of conversation on that.
Right.
But I think if you're building a live online experience, having a super clear outcome would be really important. I think one, and then two, that you're thinking about that in the context of how you're going to create an environment where people want to contribute. It's not just a talking head, right? And so I think those pieces are super important about it. I can think about even like micro learning topics because we kicked around this idea at McDonald's a while back where if we measured it from a productivity perspective, people had about 10 minutes a week for learning. And we were like, on a 5-day work week, that's about 2 minutes a day. If I built a whole learning construct around 2 minutes a day, what would it look like? And started playing with that idea and said, geez, I could do a whole week on food safety. And I could hit people 5 times with 2 minutes of really important ideas that would get the point across. I think live online learning has that same opportunity where it can be like, for 30 minutes, we're going to get on and we're going to talk about whatever it might be, this new product and what we've seen consumer reaction to it be. And I'm going to bring on John from marketing who helped us. He's the product designer. He's the one who made the product. And you're going to have the opportunity to hear from him and have the opportunity to give him lots of feedback about what you're seeing. I think those kind of learning experiences can be super helpful for people in a live environment, particularly where you've got a distributed, audience.
Yeah, so way more interactive, conversational based, not a webinar format, but can in some ways mirror the convenience of micro learning, not quite at the 2 minute, do it when you want level, 30 minutes, and you can do it from your computer or your phone. It sits in between those two. Agreed. And as you're advising learning leaders or companies about their L&D strategy, for each piece of it, there's this decision to build or buy. And so I'd be curious how you advise people to think about that choice and when to build and when to buy.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because I don't think there's one right answer for that, one. And then I think, two, it depends on the context. Thinking about McDonald's, for example, when I first came there, we had a very large sort of instructional design team, probably 3 times larger than it was when I left. And we made a conscious decision to keep a core set of people and frame their roles like architects. So your job is to create blueprints, but not build houses. And then we'll go find the general contractors out there of the world that can help us build houses. And I thought about that as a specific sort of business model, deliberate strategy around buy the building because I thought we could get more creativity. If I hired 15 e-learning designers, I know I'm only ever going to get e-learning from them. And, regardless of what the right outcome might be, it's going to be an e-learning course. So I wanted to be able to have a mindset where we could operate with a broader view and with an unboundaried view around what the experience might want to look like. And so that was, for example, part of my business model that I said, look, we're going to largely buy what we need in the marketplace from a services company to have it custom built, but we're going to buy those services. I can also think of things like, now getting more granular, like compliance content, where sometimes it's a mathematical exercise. Like at McDonald's, where I had 50,000 people that need to go through some form of compliance training. Does it make sense for me to license it in the marketplace at $5 a head every year? Or can I build it once for $50,000, even $90,000, $100,000 and do it for pennies instead? And so there was a filter around that where we always thought about, let's just build it ourselves then, so we don't have to buy it, because the economics of it on a cost per learner perspective are a no-brainer, and we have to do this anyway.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No,
the exception, and then I'll give you complete contradiction of that thinking as an exception. But like on food safety is a good example where we actually said we need to buy it. Every restaurant manager has to be certified. It's legislatively required in most places around the world, but it varies so much geographically that it's impossible to try and keep up with legislative changes and requirements and science and everything else. So you know what? Let's just leave that to the experts and we'll buy that.
Yeah, those are great examples. And I really like the analogy of the blueprint that you build internally and then the general contractor to build a house that you buy in externally, with the advantage, as you said, of creativity, breadth, keeping up with regional variations. I'd be curious what kinds of things would be in the blueprint where you felt we're not compromising this. This has to be the part of what we create, and then what pieces were more externalized and comfortable to contract out.
Yeah, if I think about in the blueprint, it would be, if I think about like crew training, it would typically be around sort of philosophical attitude towards how we want it to be experienced. So we need it to be modular. We need it so that franchisees have flexibility. So if they want to start me on the grill and you on the fryer, and we're starting on the same day, we can do that. And neither of us have to go through cashier training to get there. Neither of us have to learn each other's job. So flexibility became like a tenet for what we were doing. The other pieces would then be around scalability. How do we make sure we can drive it in almost any language, right? Or in, let's say, I think was the core we started with, right? Or in the US, English, Spanish. But you get over into Europe and the UK and you get all kinds of American English or British English, right? I need to put some U's in and drop some Z's and put some S's in and that kind of stuff.
We need to invent the language. We get to do that.
Sorry, yeah, you had it first. You just took it. So thinking about those things around audience relevance and cultural, if you will, adoption were also important components that we had in that mix, I would say. It would start literally around those kind of pieces. In a restaurant, there are 12 workstations, right? So it was like, okay, from the flexibility perspective, we want somebody to be able to start on any of these 12. And then there's some upfront pieces about what's the job all about and hospitality. And here's what McDonald's is a little bit, right? So a blueprint typically looked something like that in terms of what we wanted. And then it was here, we provide the constraints of the environment that we had to work within. Here's the learning management system we work on, or we don't think e-learning content's necessarily the best way because we know people don't learn that way. So these architects would go out and actually look in the restaurants at how people are really learning how to do the job so that we were more modeled about helping that become more effective than about learning out of context.
That's great.
Yeah, so those kind of things, constraints and requirements, I think were the best way to think about what might be in a blueprint.
Makes sense. And would those engagements then typically be the vendor is building largely bespoke one-off content for McDonald's, or would it be an off-the-shelf plus a little bit of tweaking and customization? What was typical there?
Yeah, for a restaurant audience, it was typically bespoke.
Yeah.
Customized, contextual, highly McDonald's language driven. Right. Concepts might be, I'll give you a simple example, unconscious bias. Right. So rather than teaching unconscious bias training in the restaurants, which you can readily get off the shelf, we chose to introduce it to crew in the context of the creating feel good moments idea and thinking about how they form an opinion of a customer every time they walk in the door, every time a customer walks in the door. And how do you put that opinion aside of what the experience might be? Like, oh gosh, this is not going to be very fun to let me figure out how I can turn this into a great experience for this customer. Right? Oh, they look angry when they really might not be. They're totally unrelatable to me because they don't look like me. They don't sound like me. They don't whatever like me. Those kind of things. How do you set all those biases that naturally pop up as human nature aside and still focus on creating a feel-good moment? So rather than taking off the shelf unconscious bias program and tweaking it a little, we actually said, no, actually we should reframe it in the context that people can relate to, which is that customer walking in the door.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I love how it isn't just isolated as a kind of one-off unconscious bias training, but it's tied back to that core principle of creating those enjoyable moments. I was going to ask, how do you infuse or ensure that the vendor offerings are tailored to an organization's culture? And it sounds like that was a combination of things that were in the blueprint and then bringing forth some of these pillars or principles or values and giving that to the partner so that they can brainstorm with you and create something that is in line or reinforcing of that internal culture. Is that?
Yeah, and we use an agile, I would say, process, an iterative process, where we would test and learn. We typical, let's create an alpha prototype. Let's get people's reaction to it. It might be a new way of learning something. It might be a completely different design. Let's understand the reaction so we know the change management as we try to scale. Yeah. And then some of it, I would say, to the earlier question too about off the shelf with tweaks. I think when you got into the management populations, you started to see more of that as a target opportunity where you got into coaching and giving feedback and handling conflict and those sort of bigger picture leadership issues that people deal with on a day-to-day basis. We could be much more off the shelf on that and less original content, I would say.
Yeah. A lot of universal principles there.
Exactly.
So I've got a few rapid fire questions for you, just to wrap this first part of our conversation. We've had a few folks on and they've brought up quirky cultural references that inspired them to do the L&D work that they do from outside the world of L&D. So I'd just be curious, is there one lesson or inspiration that you've taken from an unexpected source outside of the field that's helped you through your career?
That's a really good question. Outside of the field. Yeah, no, I can't say like outside of the field. There's been a lot of sources of inspiration for me inside the
Yeah.
field that are fairly abstract, like not in the common genre of things that people talk about.
Mhm.
There's a guy named Thomas Gilbert. He wrote a book called Engineering Worthy Performance in the 1970s.
Mhm.
He had this 3x2 grid basically on how to engineer performance. And I used it throughout almost my entire career as a mental model for talking people through how to solve performance issues in an organization.
Mhm.
And helping them a lot of times realize that it wasn't just training, or actually training was probably the least important thing they should focus on.
Yeah.
And so I'd say, I don't know, I guess that's an engineering construct in terms of thinking about it that way. I think some of the selling pieces, and weirdly enough, my experience at Dun & Bradstreet, where I was calling on small, medium-sized businesses for 5 years as a 20-year-old and going through their balance sheets and understanding their cash flow and everything else that I really knew nothing about because I didn't take much of that in college, is still paying off for me today. Because when I'm engaging in a conversation with a startup and they're talking about raising, and we're talking about cash flow, and we're talking about burn rates and those kind of things, I understand those pieces from things I learned 35 years ago. So it's interesting, when I was in McDonald's and I was working with franchisees, or Yum Brands and I was working with franchisees, it was the same thing. Those were the people I was calling on when I was younger. And so the mindset of those people was very much the same. And I think that I tried to put that in the front of my mind when trying to make decisions about L&D, about, to your comment earlier, thinking about the business first kind of piece. We could have some brilliant ideas about using VR, for example, but right, is a franchisee really willing to spend $1,000 on a headset in every restaurant that they own for one training program? And the answer is probably no. Right. And so I'd have to get myself past that question first before I would ever put it in front of them. So I think maybe that's outside in to answer your question, but I think that's where it comes from for me.
Those are two great examples. Yeah. As a small business, everyone has to have a DMB number. So I can see how having those conversations really gave you a ton of pattern recognition for SMB, and applying that to the franchisees is really thoughtful. Thanks for sharing that. Next segment is start, stop, continue. So if we think about the current world we live in and the trends in the industry, what do you recommend that the average learning leader stop doing at this moment?
Stop doing, this is my favorite thing, but I think this will probably get a few people talking. I think stop focusing on ROI. So, and start focusing on value. And focus on defining success, what success looks like up front. ROI tends to be a backwards looking exercise. Okay, we just spent $2 million. We trained all these people. We took them off. We were least efficient, hardest to measure, most expensive thing we just did. Now let's see, did we get an ROI from that? So for me, it would be like, stop talking about ROI, start talking more about how we define success up front with anything that we do.
Yeah.
So front end load your success that way and move off of the ROI kind of conversation.
That is a great one. And I know I said this was the quick fire portion of the conversation, but I'm not sure I can let that one go by. Yeah, no. I want to just understand it a little bit more, and I'm sure the folks listening will as well. Yes, there's often a thread about ROI and training programs, and every learning conference you go to, there's probably 3 workshops on how to measure ROI, and it's notoriously difficult. That's why there's always 3 workshops every year on it. And I agree with you. I think there's more intangible value delivered than can possibly be measured. At the same time, as a business, you want to get some sense that big ticket items, big money being spent is worthwhile. And so could you say a little more about your framework for thinking about that, and how the value piece is framed in how you approach that?
Yeah, I think that if you sit down with a stakeholder at the beginning of the sort of the cycle of a project and say, this is what we're agreeing we want done. Now, how are we going to talk about it being successful? What does it look like when it's successful? And it's interesting because a lot of times in my experience, people had to pause and really think about that. And it's, I just want them to do it. And it's, okay, great. So how are we going to know that's actually happening? Because what do you use to measure that today? And what's our pre-post look like kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
To other conversations, that would be like, I just want to know that everybody went through it. That's my success measure. Let's just make sure everyone went through it. And I'm expecting that you're going to deliver a quality program. But really, I'm not going to waste my time trying to say you move sales up by $2 a transaction or something. Mm-hmm. And some will be like, no, it needs to move sales by $2 a transaction. Mm-hmm. Right? But I think that knowing that up front saves you a lot of angst on the back end and guides the way you actually execute through the program that you design and then deliver ultimately to the organization. Because if your intended outcome is to drive sales by $2 per transaction, right? And your leader wants people upselling, then you're probably going to be super focused on making sure whether or not that's happening or not in the context of your program, and that your program is only focused on making sure that's happening. Yeah. Not a lot of extraneous things that might otherwise get incorporated into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just think it helps drive focus. It helps drive clarity. It helps drive alignment, because if somebody comes back to me afterwards and says, what's the ROI on this? Generally, I perceive that as a question of, I don't see the value in what you just did. Like, that's really telling me. And then 2, when I get that question, I come back and say, here's what we agreed upon up front as success measures. And so here's how I'm measuring against our agreed upon success measures. That's different than an ROI conversation.
Yeah. Such a good point. Such a good point.
I think that's my soapbox thing I think people should start doing. And I agree with you. You can go to any conference and there's 3 people that are running workshops, and I'm probably good friends with all 3 of them because they've been doing it for 20 or 30 years, and God love them. There is an industry on it, but I do think that it starts with people not framing expectations up front.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And so it really varies by situation and context. Let's agree with the key stakeholders what the measures of success are going to be, and that might not always be dollars and cents. In fact, often it doesn't need to be. So if you've got clear success criteria, then you can have a conversation about the value that was delivered at the end, avoiding the need for the kind of drive-by ROI question.
Yeah,
makes sense.
Because sometimes the cost of doing an ROI study actually exceeds the ROI.
So. Yeah, you've got to put that in the calculation as well.
I've seen that one before. Yeah.
That's great. So back to my quick fire. Given trends in the industry where L&D is today, what do you recommend the average learning leader start doing that they're not doing right now typically?
I think start thinking about your role and your team's role in the organization as enablers. So if you spend your time thinking about, how do I enable more people to learn more often in the organization? It will reframe your life, basically. I think in terms of the way you think about the product portfolio that you manage, which you'll still manage, but it takes you to places like, how are we leveraging collaboration systems, and how effective is Teams really at helping us build a learning organization, and side questions to maybe to the traditional L&D conversation that you're having today. It can put you in a lot more conversations about how we're enabling people to learn. I also think I feel like it's the right thing, because it's naive for us as learning leaders to think that we actually control people's learning in the organization. Right? Yeah. Like most people learn from other people, not from you. And so let's acknowledge that, and let's talk about how we make more of that possible, as opposed to sitting there saying, gosh, I need to measure my social learning strategy. So how do we unleash it?
Yeah, that's a really powerful reframe. And it really enlarges the surface area that you're thinking about as a learning leader, like you said, to collaboration tools or interactions at offsites, and can elevate the impact, which is often the reason that people go into learning and development, is want to have impact on people. There's just more ways to have more impact on people, more impact on the organization. And as you said, as a result, be in more conversations. So I think that's really powerful. Thank you.
Sure.
Last one. give a little credit where credit is due. What are you seeing people doing these days that you think is a really good idea and they should keep doing or continue doing?
I think that keep doing. It's a good question. I think that there's a lot of great things that people are doing right now. I just saw all the Brandon Hall Awards that came out and some fantastic things that different organizations are doing and getting recognition for it. I think they should keep doing the things that help drive their business forward first, and maybe their team glory second, which is sometimes hard to do.
Yeah.
But I do think that examining the things that are really helping propel the business forward are probably the things you should stay super focused on and look for more of how you can do that in an organization.
I love it. Right on. Some great pearls of wisdom there in our first part of our conversation. Let's wrap this episode here for now and then continue our conversation in part 2, where we're going to do a deep dive into AI and its impact on L&D. Thanks for listening to Learning Works. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast for our exciting lineup of future episodes. Learning Works is presented by Hone. Hone helps busy L&D leaders easily scale power skills training through tech-powered, live cohort learning experiences that drive real ROI and lasting behavior change. If you want even more resources, you can head to our website, honehq.com. That's honehq.com for upcoming workshops, articles, and to learn more about Hone.